Hello everyone, it is the Vibe Kage here. This is more or less just a shits and giggles one. Not that I'm like redoing the cheated one. In fact, this is a completely separate thing because, you know, he wouldn't have been actually dating Uraraka. This would have been one of like, oh, she's just talking to him. But let's just get into this. And, well, you know, everything goes as normal. Deku, it's like he has one for all. There's no real changes to the story. It's just how things portrayed. After Deku had saved Uraraka, one of the key differences, she asked for his number. Deku, psyched, hella hyped. He goes with it. He's just like, sure, why not? He's nervous and always texting her, but like this early confrontation helps him, get over his fears. And, here's where shit changes. She flirts with him over the phone, gives him some confidence. She's helping build Izuku for Izuku to be, acceptable at UA, I guess. Sounds fucked up, but, being timid isn't always the nicest thing, but it is what it is. And sure enough, things always progressed as normal. Here's one of the key differences. When, like, the USJ event happens, Uraraka was with Ojiro, and Ojiro pretty much, was bodyguard the entire time. So afterwards, she gives him her number, and they start texting. Ojiro was just like, aren't you and Deku together? She's just like, nah, we're just friends. He's just like, that sounds kind of sus, but I think, what am I to, say no, right? Like, she's saying it's okay, right? Well, it was a trick, my guy. So, like, a month goes by, everything's going as normal. Not a month, but, like, a week goes by, like how they need their recovery week. And while Deku was in the hospital, he did end up being questioned by a hero and her, assistant at the time. Not assistant, her sidekick in training. Who was also a UA student. And this is where I'm also making another change. He meets someone early on. Someone who's curious about Deku's power as soon as she heard about it. Because, she's insanely curious. not the Meta Liberation arc curious, but the other one. This is Nejiri Hato and Ryuku. They're asking Deku about, like, the Nomu and, like, is there anything in particular, like, that he can remember to, like, bring down or help with their investigations for Shigaraki. And Nejiri, she's there because, she's asking Deku about a lot of things. And, one of the main questions is, like, why is your power, like, so if you're using it all at once? She then says, like, she can't do that because then she'll always be tired. She says she lowers the percentages of her output, like 30%, 20%. Deku, he's just like, he grabs Nejiro by the hands. And he's like, arigatou gozaimasu. Like, thank you very much on some, like, high level shit. And, she's just like, huh? Like, she blushes real quick. Ryuku catches on. So she's just like, I'ma, like, roast her for this later on in life. But this is just for shits and giggles, my guys. So remember, this is just a one shot. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna make this as funny as fucking possible for y'all. So continuing on, Deku, during this next week of training for the sports festival, he unlocks one for all full counting, and he realizes he's fucked because he only has like 5%. And he's just like, damn it. But during that entire week, he decided to do something incredibly risky, but taxing and worthing on his body. What he had done is pretty much like how, Goku and, I forgot his name, Gohan. Damn, I forgot him like Akira Toriyama forgot him. I said it. We all know it. Anyway. And that sucks because I do love Gohan. Anyway, Deku, he decides to do one for all 5% for as long as physically possible to increase stamina output. Now, he did this, and for the first day, it was kind of easy. He knows during sleep, he'll be unconscious, but his desire to do it kind of actually left One For All running at 1% the entire time he was asleep. And I'm like, no, that, I don't know, it wasn't even a saved number, so I didn't even read it. I just looked at the number and I go like, oh, not saved. Fuck you. Anyway, Izuku, not realizing that the constant flow of One For All through his all body is actually adapting his muscles. Kind of like the vibrations of a muscle causing it to strengthen it, but on a much different level. Now, One For All is also, just for this. Oh my god, I got my back to pop a little bit. That felt great. Anyway, just for the sake of, fun, and his quirks, like quirk dreams, are starting to come in a lot earlier before even Shinzo's happening, just because how more usage of One For All he's getting it. He's getting more adapt to it. Now, keep in mind, All Might don't know about this, nobody know about this, he's keeping this a secret. In fact, he spent like his 2 weeks ghosted Uraraka, which allowed her to, talk with Ojiro. Ojiro and her started to do more things. Ojiro, he's also was the kind of timid nature one because, karate, discipline, all that good jazz. He must not, forsaken himself. But, eventually it does get to the point where, Uraraka does manage, steal a kiss and get him on a wavelength that I must spend money on her. Shit like that. And during this week, Deku, literally 2 days before the sports festival, in his dream, he meets One For All users, all of them. Well, the ones that have been highlighted, they're still Ghosty, All Might, and then the second and third user being Ghosties and Silhouette. They're telling him, you're not strong enough for our powers yet, so chill the fuck out. Instead, this is when Lariat, Nana Shimura, and then the fourth user, spoiler warning, fourth user, One For All, had Spidey Sense. Deku's new quirk is Spidey Sense. He has Black Whip and Spidey Sense. So he maybe he'll become a Spider-Man, Superman hybrid, and I would fucking love it, because he's already flying. He don't need Black Whip for web shooting, but it's bungee gum almost in a sense. Which, bungee gum or Black Whip? Black Whip. Black Whip all the way, actually. Because Deku, okay, spoiler warning for something that Deku learned how to do, but he learned how to shoot Black Whip out of his mouth, my guy. Like how Froppy uses her tongue. So Deku clearly has learned Froppy's tongue game. I said my joke and I said my piece. Whoa! Anyway. I'm sorry. Story breaking is a bad tendency of mine, but I'm going back to this because this is a funny story that I thought of, fucking drunk with a few people the other day, a couple days ago. But that's not why we're here. Anyway, Izuku during this time, as he's meeting them, they explain to him, after a certain percentage, these quirks will start to unlock. Deku's just like, wait, what? They're telling. Nana's just like, yeah, my float comes at 30%, his comes at 20%, his is Black Whip. She points to Spidey Sense guy and go he's at 50%. Go hello. He's very, soft-pitched. Not really, a deep voice, despite the scar on his face. But, nah. Anyway, then Deku looks over to the other user, and he's just like, what's his quirk? And, he just talks to Deku in his head, and he's saying, we can read, pretty much, fuck. I was thinking Jean Grey, you can read people's minds, talk to people in their heads, and then move things with your minds. Telekinesis. Deku then says, oh, my mom has telekinesis. Then I think he was the fifth user? No, fifth user, sixth user, fourth user. No, he would have been the sixth user, Nana Shimura's teacher. Watch him be Inko's father, or related to Inko in some way. That'd be one hell of a thing if every One For All user ended up being related to someone that Deku knows in some way. Because, Nana Shimura is already related to Shigaraki. So it'd be kind of cool. I mean, we don't know who Black... And Larry could be, I guess, related to Zero in a way. Or like, the whipping thing eventually turns to tape. I'm story breaking, god damn it. Man. Anyway, the sixth user, he looks at the others, and he just points to Deku and saying, I like him. Their eyes widen and go like, you got him to speak. He normally just uses his quirk. Deku's just like, cool? Deku, he's looking at the, One For All users, and, he's asking them, why are they here? And then they said, well, the reason normally they're telling him the percentages is because it's something that you would have to do because your body got used to it at the high ferocity. You are kind of changing that by doing this constant thing. We didn't know anyone would think like this. So, they're asking, Deku's just like, So, they're saying, pretty much when you get to like 15%, you're gonna be getting a higher boost with our powers. Deku's just like, what do you mean? They then in turn tell him, due to his constant like training, his body adjusting to this relatively quickly, the other quirks are becoming more, they're awakening faster pretty much. They're getting stronger within him faster. Even if it's like a slow charge, it's still charging up even more rather than, the big smashes. Deku in his head is just like, wow, I owe Nejire a lot. Which, Nana Shimura is just like, I prefer her over the brown-haired one. Deku's just like, wait, what? Nana's just like, I'm just saying. She just seems like a nicer person. Deku's just like, oh, no, Uraka's nice and all. And then he just realized, I've not talked to her in 2 weeks, have I? I've kinda, Nana's just like, it's better. Women's intuition, like, just, okay? She pats him on the shoulder and, leaves. This is where things get more fun. Because, the very next day, Deku, he tells his mom something interesting. And, Inko is, curious. And then Deku shows his full cowling. Inko's like, sweetie, you're not breaking your bones. And I'm like, I know. Isn't that cool, Mom? Oh my god, my voice cracked. Oh my god, I'm dying. Oh. Anyway, Deku's just like, yeah, I know. Isn't that great, Mom? And, she's just all smiling. And then Deku's saying, oh, I may... And I do mean may. He's saying, there was like this one instance, and he was kind of confused. Inko's just nodding. Sweetie? She's thinking, I'm like, wait. I thought he liked girls. And Inko's just like, well, I love him still. He's still my son, but I guess that explains why he's always calling Bakugo Kachan, despite him being a total shitbag. Inko's just like snapping back to her head when Izuku's just like, Mom? Oh, I'm sorry, Izuku. Continue. And Deku's just like, I think, he's saying your quirk might be more active than I realized. Inko's just like, huh? Deku explains that at one instance, he hasn't been able to do it again, but, rather than a throw smash, he was able to use something similar to, like, what he thought was, telekinesis, a repelling force to stop something from falling. And, he hasn't been able to access it again, but it's something that happened, and that if it starts happening more, not to trip. Inko then, like, she starts tearing up, because, this isn't what she thought, but this is something, slightly more happier than any news she thought she could need, and that is, her quirk is actually manifesting in her son, who wants to be a pro hero. So her support is slowly manifesting into Izuku, is what she's thinking. Like, her actual hope for him being a pro hero. Like, she's thinking this is the sign. She's crying and hugging and saying, "We gotta cook your favorite meal." And Deku's just like, "Oh, can we invite some people?" Ned, Inko's just like, "Oh, sure." And, ooh, I love this song. Medicine by Bring Me the Horizon, but not the right vibe right now. Anyway, I can't skip this song. It runs deep through my very soul. Let's do this. Anyway, Izuku's just like, in his head, what he thought first was, I should invite Nejire to thank her, for that tip. Because of her, I'm getting one for a lot more easier. So, he does shoot her a text saying, "Hey, there's something I wanted to talk to you about, like something I wanted to show you." Nejire's just like, "Oh, really?" Deku's saying meet her at Dagobah Beach, and that, if she wants to stay for dinner, his mom's doing a big food thing, and that they're inviting some friends. Nejire's saying, "Oh, okay." Just happily playing along, not really doing much, not thinking much right now. And, Deku also invites Uraku. Uraku saying she can't come right now, but rain check. Deku kind of saddened by this, but he's just like, "Oh, okay, miss you. Sorry, I've been busy, healing and training." Uraku's just like, "Oh, no, it's fine, Deku. I knew you were doing you, and I was doing me." When Deku read I was doing me, he felt a disturbance in the force. Just like, wait, hold up. Huh. Some don't feel right about that, but okay. Deku then says, how about after the sports festival, is over, or during the sports festival, we, talk, get lunch, have more one-on-one times. Uraka's just like, I don't know. Like, she's not mad, but, like, a gift would be a good way to, lessen his, sentencing. Deku's just like, okay, agreeing that he'll get her something. Like I said, she's playing my dude. Now, here's where the fun part comes in. Deku, he meets Nejire, he shows her full cowling, and when he powers up to his utmost limit, he realizes something very important. His new limit is actually 10%. Why did I double it? For the sake of plot. And also his muscles are just so used to it that they didn't even realize that, oh, we doubled in anticipation for this power. Just for the sake of bullshit. Deku's saying, thanks to her, he can actually handle, he went from being able to do a constant 5 to a constant 10, and that's why he wanted to invite her, and he asked her more about her quirk, and he pulls out a notebook and starts and she's even curious about it, so they're going back and forth about asking questions. Deku's asking about Nejire, Nejire's asking about Deku and his weird notebooks. Deku gets kind of embarrassed about explaining how he's been a hero nerd and how his quirk was such a late bloom. Then Nejire's saying maybe, his quirk was so powerful, that's why it took so long to, manifest. She's starting to, butter up Izuku in a way that, makes him feel a slightly different happiness that he's used to, opposed to, when Uraku would give him attention, or when female classmates would give him attention, or when, female family members gave him attention. This is someone who makes him genuinely feel like he has some worth. Not as they were above him in a way. Deku, because for so long, being quirkless in his mind, if you have a quirk, you were instantly better than him, and he might not have realized that. Yeah, but it was one of those, mental shackles that he had in his mind that slowly, being unlocked thanks to Nejire. Deku, he comments how he likes Nejire being so bubbly and friendly, and Nejire, she's just like, well, it's not her power demanded her having high stamina and all this good noise. And Deku's just saying he wishes he should have paid more attention to her, you know, so he could have better notes than this. He feels like he's not getting a good, you know, notes down. And, Nedry is saying, but you've been scribbling a lot. And Deku, he then blushes because even though he's recorded it mentally and not written it down yet, the entire time Deku was with Nedry, while yes, he did, like, draw her and, well, yeah, that's what he was doing. He was drawing her. He wrote her name, her likes, dislikes, the basic stuff, not her hero stuff yet, but, like, her personal information. And Nedry, she eventually snags a look at the book and, she thanks Deku for the drawing. Deku's just like, wait, what? And, Nedry's saying, can she not keep it? Deku, he's just like, I kind of need it for my notes. Nedry's just like, raises an eyebrow. Notes? She then gets a little bit flirty. And, and in case you're wondering, but Nedry is too much of an airhead. Shut the fuck up. I'm doing me, my man. Just go with it. Anyway, Deku, he pretty much, he goes to, Deku, he's kind of blushing right now, as Nedry kind of, like, floats over towards him. She's saying, is there a other secret notebook? One about only, the women that you're interested in? Deku, he's just like, no, nothing like that. That doesn't exist. No, it's just, like, Nedry just, like, she friendly just, like, pats him on the back. And she's saying she thinks, like, Deku's kind of cute when he's all flustered. Deku, he gets more flustered. He's just like, fuck, I thought I was over this. They're like, Uraka, you didn't help me with this. I thought you would. Water. Anyway, as time, progresses, they go back and, people who are invited to eat were obviously Aizawa, because homeroom teacher and Deku wanted to tell Aizawa that sports festival time, and All Might's there too. He told them that he has a good surprise for them, like, on how he can, control his power a bit more efficiently now. All Might and Aizawa just smile and nod. All Might and Inko, they're sitting next to each other. Nejire and Deku, they're sitting next to each other. Now, Aizawa, he's sitting next to Ryuk. And, Aizawa's just like, oh, Ryuk, why are you here? And, Deku thought it'd be rude if he invited, just Nedry and not, Ryuk. Because, also, he was trying to not make it seem like he was showing just interest in Nedry to his mom. And, like, he's trying to, like, say, no, we're friends. We good. We not doing anything, Mom. I would never. Alright, then. But, as time, they have a good dinner. Aizawa and Ryuk, they've had a little bit to drunk. All Might's just laughing at them. Because, Aizawa's constantly doing the eye glare. While Ryuk is just, like, on occasions, juggling. And Inko would, like, try and throw the thing off because she's also a little bit drunk. All Might's the only sober one because, he's the DD for the two heroes. And, Nedry and Deku, they've talked. They've had a little good time together. Nedry, she makes the joke, like, I guess it's next time it's Deku to meet her parents. And she winks at him. Deku, he's just like, sure? He's just, like, thinking, well, I'm not officially with Uraraka, and I was doing me. He's just like, she was doing her, and I'm just finishing doing me. He's just thinking, I could just have maybe Nedry as a good friend after this, and, things will be fine. No, my guy, things are not going to be fine. I'm sorry, Deku. But, it's the next day, and it's school. This festival's happening as normal. And, Deku, he meets Uraraka, and he gives her, what was it that I thought of? A bracelet, yes. He gave her now, this is a, universal theme, space theme bracelet, so it has the planet, it's the solar systems, there's the sun, Mars, Venus, Earth, Mercury, all them planets. I know I said it out of order, I don't remember the order exactly. I know it's Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Pluto. I know Pluto was not technically a planet, but like I think that's how it was. No, not Pluto. Uranus or Uranus, depending on how motherfuckers want to say it. I just don't really give a fuck. You're like, yeah, no, I get it. They're saying you're asshole. And I'm like, okay, I care why. Anyway, as I'm continuing, and Deku, you know, he reluctantly had to sell some All Might merch to afford this bracelet, but he's thinking I was kind of a dick and ghosted her for 2 weeks, and I do owe her like a huge apology, and rather than saying it, just express it. Actions speak louder than words, right? Oh my god, I'm sorry, but when Uraka, she wears the bracelet and she's really happy. She thanks Deku. She gives him a kiss on the cheek. Deku, he's just like, yes, I'm good again. And not really, my guy, but I'm not here to bust your bubble like that. Hell yeah. Anyway, this Ojiro sees this and he was kind of confused, but he doesn't say anything right now. He just waits for Uraka to, go alone. And, he walks up when Deku leaves because, he's getting dressed. It's time for the events. And, Ojiro is just like, hey, what was that about? She's just like, oh, it was nothing. She wraps her arms around Ojiro and then, starts kissing him, making out with him. Ojiro at first was hesitant, but, he falls back into it and kisses her back. He pulls away after a while and he's saying, so why did he give you a gift? Uraka's just saying, he was just being a good friend. Ah, shit. Alright, so y'all know what this is about. What if Deku was implanted with Kawaki Seal? What if Tatsumi had found the Omnitrix? Yes. Here we are. So you guys know what's coming come 2021. Because I have to finish other ones. I'm sorry. But yes, some hype for the new year, I guess. I don't even want the new year to happen. I'm not going to lie to you. But, during this time, a motherfucker, shitty motherfucker named Monoma had seen this and, motherfucker just like, click, taking a photo. Because, he saw Uraka kiss Deku and all this, and, he's then gonna spread this through 1B, get it circulating that, Uraka and Ojiro take them down. They're a couple. And things kind of progress as normal. Deku, he's still not shown anyone full calling besides Nejire and his mom. And, he's excited to, bust out 10%. Let's go. He's ready for it. He's excited for this bullshit. Now, Deku, how can I put this? He's kind of happy. He's waiting. Things are still going normal as canon, actually. I can't really lie to you on that. Bakugo still gives his speech. But, the key difference is when he's saying, I'm gonna win this. Before anyone can yell out, Deku just like, starts laughing. Bakugo gets pissed. And saying, you got a problem, you damn nerd! Then Deku, literally, from the ground, looking at, Bakugo saying, you might be, there right now, but understand this. By the end of the sports festival, you will be at my feet. Midnight, she's just like, yes! Such manly, ferocious youth! Yeah! Like a perverted Mike Guy, in a sense, but without the training and more about the BDSM punishment. Anyway, fuck, that's just too funny, because I legit just thought, what if Mike Guy was a BDSM master? And I go like, what he teaches Lee besides the 8 inner gates. Lee, this is how you use a whip. I'm fucking horrible. Anyway, as, Midnight and She just says, "Alright, that's enough, boys." Telling Bakugo to get down and it's time to start this shit. They say, it's the run part. And Deku, he's just like, yes! With the training he was able to get thanks to Nedre-san, he was able to be more adept for this. Now, he does not run off just yet, because then, he realizes right away there's only that one doorway. But, when they say go, Deku just saying, we have to just leave the arena, right? It doesn't have to be through that doorway. Well, she's saying, she smiles because she realizes Deku caught on. She's saying, is there another exit that you can think of? Deku starts powering up one for all, full cowling. So green lightning is sparking off of him. Everyone in the arena is seeing him, except for the students, because they're still, smashing themselves up against that hole. Like most guys with Uraraka. Haha! I'm going to do her dirty. I don't know why, but it's just too funny. Anyway, Todoroki still does his ice bird thing, but no one noticed him do the ice until after they realized, fuck, it's cold, because they just heard a giant, wind pressure gust. All Might and Aizawa thought, damn it, Izuku, I thought you said you had... Wait a minute, his legs aren't broken. Because Deku, he jumped from, the ground to the ledge on the stadium, jumps back up, he then does a full, flick in the air to give him more air momentum, flips over, lands on the top of the stadium, and then just goes forward like he was a motherfucking ninja. The stadium was looking at Izuku. The camera's focused on Izuku. Class 1A, 1B, all of UA students, they didn't know shit. Todoroki thinks he's still, good because, he froze all the machines, to get by. As soon as he gets out, everyone's saying, that's not going to be enough, Todoroki, to stop us. Todoroki, he's, right as he's walking, this is when, Deku yells, smash! And punches the robot, slamming it down, blocking Todoroki's path and everyone else forward. Todoroki looks up to see green lightning just pass beyond him, and he's just like, what the fuck? Class 1A and the UA students, they're looking behind them, they're like, where the what the, wait, what? No, where are the broken bones? Where's him crying all the goddamn time? He's not supposed to do that. He can't use good power without crying or breaking something. That don't make sense. Todoroki now has to be pissed, he's pissed off because, he's trying to, blast, he has to use his fire side right now to, burn a hole through the robot rather than just use ice because he realizes that'll take too long and Deku's getting in his way. And you know what else realized? As soon as he finished the fire blast, he had to use his goddamn fire. So, he's hesitating for a second. He makes a fist, clenching it, because now he's just thinking, you know what, Midoriya? I'm going to fucking crush you. And then he just goes off, blasting off using his ice to propel him forward. Kind of like Frozone in a sense. He's trying anyway. And, by the time he finally gets to the, what was it called? The cavern with all the strings and the pads. This is where Izuku shows most prominence with his movements because he cleared it the moment he got it, and he's already at the landmines. So Todoroki, the moment he hears Izuku's already in the next obstacle, Class 1A, they're barely getting past, they're halfway into the thing where they're over the trench in the arena. And this is Sullivan King, and I fucking love him. He's the best EDM artist I've ever heard in my life. He was my first EDM concert as Slugtopia. Fucking love this song. A bit too sad for this moment, though. Solace by Sullivan King. Listen if you want to. Anyway, as Izuku, he's pretty much cleared his land. He sees how the landmines are. So he's just okay. He jumps up using full cowling in the middle of the ring, throws a smash as he's falling down, propelling him forward, crossing it, and he's number one, just so I can get that out of the way. This shocks fucking every 1A student the most, because they know that Izuku shouldn't be able to do this. Granted, for some reason, they're not as strong, so they're quickly to figure out, okay, so for the sake of power, he's not breaking his bones, but why now? They're thinking of all the fucking times. This is the one time they thought they can get past Deku and shit on him. But no, Deku is doing the shitting on people. And, well, it's just too much fun for Deku not to, smile as he's, waving. And, the first person to, cheer for Deku, because, everyone's still kind of surprised at Deku, was Nejire. So Nejire actually stood up in the crowd and yelled, "Way to go, Izuku!" Cameras flash on her, and she sees herself on the giant screen, and, she just smiles and waves to the cameras. And, this is when Prison Mike makes the joke. And it looks like young Midoriya's got a fan! One from a third year? Way to go, young Midoriya! This is when Aizawa tells Mike to, shut up. And, Mike is, looking at Aizawa like, how dare you? And, he's just saying, Midoriya, I gotta say. He's saying this over the thing. The progress that he made within the 2 weeks was astounding. Good water. So Pro Heroes have heard, Midoriya being endorsed by the Pro Hero Eraserhead. So they're like, offers instantly. We've seen what he can do. He is creative. So the storyline is already changing a lot. I love this song. Too sad though. What the fuck? I'm trying to have good shit. Anyway. Oh, that's so sad. I'm gonna pause this so I can find a song that's not sad. Alright, we Gucci. If you know, you know. I ain't gonna say the name of the song, I ain't gonna say who's the artist, but if you know it, I fucking love you. And you know the vibes. Anyway. Deku, he's smiling at this, and Uraraka, she's just like, oh, so that's what he was doing over the 2 weeks. Pissed off. Everyone still comes in and, their places in canon. And, Bakugo and Todoroki are insanely more pissed off at it. Izuku, who's giving them a shit-eating grin. And, he's just, looking at Bakugo and he's saying, number one, right? And then he, busts out with a little chuckle. As, he just casually walks away. This is when they do the Calvary battle. And, Deku's just like, fuck. Now, here is another key difference. When, Izuku was named as number one, he wasn't scared. This time he was just like, yes, this could be more fun. Now, him being a bit more confident shows. So he was, smiling. He made a fist as green lightning instantly sparked off of him, which started to intimidate a lot of people. And, of course, fuck. Deku goes to Ida. Ida turns him down. When he goes to Uraraka's with, Ojiro, who is with Shinzo. And, Shinzo's just he's thinking he's about to get, Izuku. Like he's saying, I'm sorry, do you know them? I already asked them to be on my team. Right as Deku was about to answer, this is when Hatsune just grabs Deku and saying, you, number one, be a team with me. Deku's just like, who? Pink. Okay. And, he just waves to Uraraka and to Uraraka and Ojiro. They're kind of spaced out, so they're not really paying attention. Because brainwashed. But it happens regardless. Now, this is where our storyline is changing. Since Uraraka's not on his team, Deku is thinking, who can he, get? Now, this is something else that I thought would be more interesting. During this time Mineta still asks, um, Shoji, not Shoji, no, is it Shoji? Yeah, Mezo Shoji. Yeah, I had it right. Shoji. Ah, that's where I was fucking it up from Naruto. Anyway, he still tells him they'd be the perfect team, and during this time, Deku had approached another like female in his class that he thought would be at least cool with him, and she agreed just because she was there when she saw Midoriya at USJ and how his power was great, and the new control he has, she has more faith in him. So she decides to side with Midoriya and this support course girl, and this is when Suyu says, "We need one more person, and if you're having me, I think it's fair if we get my boyfriend." She blushes when she says this. Deku's just like, who? She then points to Tokiyami, and Deku's just like, I knew it! But no, Deku, he starts, like, smiling, because he's just like, yes! Deku's saying him and Uraka have been talking steadily. This is when, Froppy looks at Deku, and, saying, Uraka Ochako? Deku nods and saying, who else would I be talking about? Froppy, she pulls out her phone and showing Uraka and, Ojiro making out. And you see, the photo, just for the sake of funniness and simplicity, it does have the angle where Uraka is, wearing the bracelet. So it's in, full view, so Deku can see that this shit was literally taken, if not right as he left, minutes afterwards. So, a deep rage boils within him. Such a rage, this is key. This will be key. Why this rage, is important. But he starts, focusing, calming down. He's saying, we'll gladly take Tokiyami. Tokiyami, this is where things are different. Suyu is now the writer. Hatsume, Deku, they have their, things in the front and, as the sides, and Tokiyami's still the front. And, this is what Izuku, his plan was. Since, he can do small wind pressures and gusts, he can help with, projectiles. Tokoyami can do defense, and Suyu's tongue can help snatch, people's, headbands when they're not looking or paying attention. They agree with this plan, and things go kind of as normal. The U's, with Shinzo, taking third, Todoroki coming in second, Bakugo in fourth, and Midoriya in first, thanks to him never losing his headband. Now, I bet you're wondering, but what about the fights? Well, things still kind of go as normal, with Ida trying to use reciprocal burst, but Deku being able to use one for all, at this very moment, as the guy rushed at, Tenya Ida is rushing at Izuku with reciprocal burst, Izuku focuses one for all as much as he can on his eyes, seeing Ida's movements, just keeping up with him. And, he sticks out his hand and he just wants to push Ida away, but, he doesn't have enough time to, actually make a hand, pull back his hand and just threw a palm strike. So instead, as his hand raises, out of nowhere, and I mean out of nowhere, and this is what kind of surprises a lot of people, Deku's hand raises up, in a motion to, halt Ida, and a wave, and I mean, it was a visible, force push, it almost looked like a shockwave happened right before Izuku's palm, as it, sent, Ida back with his reciprocal burst. Now, this almost did knock down Todoroki if it wasn't for his motherfucking ice, who literally put it and froze everyone standing. This hurt them, not physically, but, it sent a chill down their spines. Because, Midoriya just kind of said, nah, Shinra Tensei. No, Tensa? Tensei. Huh. I'm gonna have to look that up later. But, Deku just realizes, that was the other user's power. Oh, I've waited for that one. Oh, I will continue this, and I will finish this first. Redoing this. You know what? Fuck it. I will make this into a 2-parter, just so I have my break to see Aizawa's video, and I can laugh, because that shit is going to be fucking funny. But no, as Deku was, in the middle of his, epiphany of, I have my quirk again, my quirks, All Might and Aizawa, eyes wide, because they're like, what the fuck was that? Inko at home, she's just like, my baby used my quirk. She's crying even more. She's happy because, and she's also kind of confused because, her quirk can do, like, small objects. Like, Deku damn near just, like, yeeted this motherfuckers into, like, the fucking arena. They were almost out of bounds. She's confused, like, did Deku's, like, physical strength have to do something with his telekinesis? Or, like, what's up with this? Just kind of confused. So she's, unbeknownst to Deku and All Might, she starts researching quirks. So she goes through Midoriya's stuff, and, she's looking through all the quirk notebooks as, the sports festival continues, which is very key to this. So, we're continuing on. And Deku, he's happy because, time runs out. Bakugo, he just barely got done dealing with Monoma and his bullshit. And he was pissed that he didn't get a chance to fight Izuku, but he did see Izuku, kind of telekinetically push down another team. He's like, what the fuck? That shouldn't be possible. I thought he was just strong. How does he have his... And he thinks mother's quirk. And, Bakugo was able to say this out loud. So, this is when... Yeah. And just for the sake of hilarity, Izuku's just like, wow. It was like my mom's. See you hearing this. Midoriya, are you is All Might your dad or something? I know I said your power was similar to him on the bus, but now you're saying you have your mom's too? Deku's just like, huh? No! Like, he starts explaining his dad had a fire-breathing quirk and his name was Sasashi, and if Tsuyu does not believe him, like, he'll ask his mom for a birth certificate or something, like, a photo. This is not what it... no, he's not All Might's son. He's just, like... I guess... And, this Tokoyami starts laughing because, this is just like Tsuyu. And, it does end with them being, closer friends. And, Hatsume thanks Deku. And, before she goes, she starts feeling up Deku like how she did when Deku was asking for modifications on his suit, which, Deku, he goes red. Uraraka, she's out of her trance, and what she wakes up to is seeing Deku being felt up by Hatsume. Now, Nejire, in the stands, you can, she visibly got pissed. She started to scowl. She started to, move around in her seat like she was, uncomfortable. And Ryuko being next to her, and she's just like, oh, kid, you got it bad. Okay. I will do you a favor. Ryuk just taps on Nejiri's shoulder, and Nejiri just like, huh, what? Ryuk does look at Nejiri and saying, so, is there something between you two? She's just shaking her head. No. She turns a little bit red. And, Ryuk is just saying, so why are you so, annoyed by him being felt up by someone his age? You don't really talk to guys your age, and Ryuk says she never figured Nejire liking younger guys. Nejire, she's saying, it's not that. It's, Nejire just, like, looks down and she's just saying, he is just special. She does that, like, Hinata, like, finger touching, just like, like she's looking down. Ryuk, she notices this, and, she's not making fun of her right now. She just, like, places, a reassuring hand on Nejire's back and saying, okay, since, Aizawa's his homeroom teacher, I'll see about, your, what were they called? Internships. She looks at Ryuk and she's just like, really? Ryuk's just nodding and just saying, yeah, I think maybe, since you totally have a crush on him. Nejire's just like, it's not like that. Ryuk's just laughing. The pro heroes around her are just laughing and they're nodding. Oh, yeah. Like, totally. She totally got it for the kid. This is when, I'm going to just say for the sake of hilarity, Miss Joke saying, like, she looks at Ryuk, because she's just, like, at the seat above them, saying, so, what do you mean you and Aizawa were close? This catches Ryuk off guard. Then Nejire is just like, huh. Oh, Nejire just, like, before she leaves, she's just saying, I'm gonna go get, something, like a quick bite to eat, because, her quirk requires her to eat a lot, and she needs a lot of power, her excuse to leave. And then she looks at Miss Joke, and she's saying, oh, the other night when, her and Ryuk went over to eat at Izuku's house, Aizawa and her were drinking and being very friendly with one another. She smiles innocently, like, but her eyes are closed, because if you look in her eyes, you can tell, like the satisfaction of, like, haha, bitch, I got you now. Because, she leaves as Miss Joke is, like, staring daggers at Ryuk. And, Aizawa feels this dark chill going up his spine. And he's just like, President Mike just asks him, hey, you okay, buddy? And, Aizawa's just saying, like, I don't know. I felt something dark. Like, he can sense the danger. Oh, fuck. This is just too much fun. But no, here comes the battle brackets, and here's where things change. When Ojiro tries to, leave the fight, he thought Uraraka would agree with him. And, this kind of outs Uraraka, because, Ojiro's saying, but what about, like, the 2 weeks we spent together? I thought we were doing good. Izuku then asks, wait, what? Uraraka's just like, shit. Just like, fuck. Deku's just like, did that really happen just because I didn't text you? Ojiro's just like, huh? Deku starts going on. This is so entertaining that, the TV cameras had to zoom in and catch the shit and play it just for the sake of my what if and hilarity, because the world shall know. Deku's saying, at the entrance exam when Uraraka was, like, pinned down by, like, some rubble, Deku saved her, and, they started talking for a little bit. They didn't do much, like, boyfriend-girlfriend stuff, but, they were doing, like, talking in potential relationships. Ojiro then states, after the USJ attack, when those two were paired off in the city, and Ojiro was saving her ass a lot, because he thought he had to, she was, like, there. So things get slightly different. So, only Class 1B's, chubby little dude, I forgot his name, I feel bad. His quirk is pretty cool, I'm not gonna lie. Only he drops out, and the person who, steps up is still Tetsu rather than Aibara. Aibara wanted to, but, out of the four, they all played a game of rock, paper, scissors. And Tetsu won. Well, surprise, he picked scissors while, Aibara picked paper. Who would have seen that coming? But no, this is where things get more interesting, because now Ojiro decides that he is gonna stay, and he's looking forward to fighting, Uraka. Everyone's just like, oh shit, this is entertaining. We did not expect this show, but this is fun. So they take special consideration on the brackets, and the brackets are as followed. Rather than Deku v Shinzo, it is now Deku versus Uraraka. The whole stadium cheered when they see Deku's name, and then they saw Uraraka. They're like, yes, justice. Deku, he's just like cracking his knuckles, smiling. He's just like, this is gonna be fun. Deku, he's smiling. Next fight is Ojiro versus Todoroki. Next fight is Seto versus Shinzo. After that one is Ida versus Bakugo. From there is Kaminari versus Kirishima. From there it's Tetsu versus, Tokoyami. And last but not least is Momo versus Tsuyu. Now, I will, since I'm doing this as a two-parter, and I'm almost at an hour, maybe like, yeah, I think, yeah, I'm going to go a little bit longer. I know where to stop. So Deku, there's that, like, time break, and, Uraraka's trying to, like, plead her case, and, like, Deku just doesn't say anything. He just leaves. He's going out. He stands on the top of the building of the UA Sports Festival, and, he's just thinking to himself, he's just thinking, fuck, like, he needs to return that bracelet. He just starts thinking to himself, he got to return the bracelet now. Like, he got to get his money back. He starts, like, blaming himself for, being so blinded. And, the classic line, when you look at someone with rose-colored glasses, all red flags just look like flags. So, yeah. Of course, someone just, like, asks if he's okay. Deku turns around, and, it's his former teammate, Froppy. Froppy, she's the emotional support. She's telling Deku, Uraraka, she kind of a thought. And, well, at least the world knows she a thought. Deku, he's just like, yeah, I guess that's good. He's still kind of depressed, but, sure enough, another person just floats up to him. And when I mean float, I do mean, like, she's floating from her spot when she realizes where Izuku was. So, she comes up, and, Deku, he was still looking at Froppy, so he didn't notice, Nejire in front of him until he, like, looked forward, and he's just like, Nejire-san, how are you? Nejire, she sits next to Deku. She asks Deku how he is. Tsuyu, she's just, like, looking at Nejire, and she remembers, this is the girl who cheered for Izuku. Tsuyu then smiles and saying, I see you're in good company, Deku. I'm going with, Tokoyami. And, she's saying, good luck with, Uraraka. And, when he wins, he's gonna have to fight either Ojiro or Todoroki. And that one's gonna be interesting. But no, that's pretty much how our things are going. Nejire, she's telling Deku that, Ryuku was impressed by him, and how he's using his quirk, and, if he continues to put on a good performance, maybe, she'll scout him, and, maybe they'll get to do their work study together. Is it the work study or the internship? Fuck. No, it's a work study. No, internship. Workplace study, my bad. So, not the other ones that I said yet. Damn. It's kind of weird how they broke it up 3 different times. Huh. I just noticed that. Damn. Anyway, Deku, he's smiling at Nedre because, this is a really good offer. And, he says he'll do his best, to make sure that Nedre and doesn't, lose face value because, she said, like, Deku, is good. Nedre blushes. She's just like, it wasn't exactly like that. And, Deku's just like, oh, so I guess I still have to impress you too, huh? He said it with, like, a smile. And, in her mind, Nedry's just like, how little you know, boy. You already have. And, Deku, he's just continuing on. He starts to feel happy as, he's feeling less and less frustration and anger towards what happened with Uraraka, until, like, the match is called and Deku is just like, okay. Let's do this. So, Deku, he steps up. Uraraka, she's saying, Izuku, it's not as, like, bad as, it seems we can work. Deku's just saying, I'm gonna need that bracelet back. Deku's just saying, it costs a lot of money and, it's not meant to be around trash. Uraraka's just like, she reveals her true colors and she's like, oh no, fuck you, I'm like keeping this shit. This shit's worth a lot of money, you said, right? Well, fuck you, I'm gonna pawn it and keep that money. Deku's just like scowling and he's just like, I feel like a total idiot for even liking you. Uraraka just like chuckles and saying, well, I never liked you. Deku's just like, can we start yet? Midnight's just like, begin. Deku with green sparks of lightning had already shown up behind Uraraka as he elbows her right in the spine, sending her forward. But before she can go any farther, Deku grabs her by the ankle and starts spinning around at high speeds, throwing her up in the air and jumping up. And just as, like, moment of impact, he yells, St. Louis smash! As he heel kicks her down into the ground. It's done. Fight over. KO, flawless victory. Deku sustains no damage. The crowd is just screaming and cheering. That was epic. On some high-level fanboy shit. Hello, Chungus. My cat just jumped on me. Meow. Hello, Chungus. I don't know. I have the mic close to her, but with the music in the background, I don't know if y'all can hear her purring. Oh, there she is. Oh, I love you too, Chungus. Hey, I'm trying to record, Chungus. Chungus, no, that's my phone you're trying to get to. Okay, I'm giving you pets. I'm giving you pets with my other hand, Chungus, okay? This is what I have to deal with. She's sometimes a drama queen. Oh. I love you, though, Chungus. Enanyway, as time progresses, the round of Ojiro and Shinzo, Endeavor still pisses off Shoto. So Shoto does the same iceberg to one-shot Ojiro. Ojiro's kind of pissed off at, what he did. And, before the next fight starts, Deku, he already had taken the bracelet, and, Nejire, she, like, hugs Izuku for congratulating him on his win, and how fast that was. Deku, he's smiling, when, Nejire, she's, like, blushing, and, she's saying, well, congratulations, you impressed me. And, Deku, he smiles, as, he's saying, well, I'm glad I did. Deku, he's smiling at her. And, this is when, he decides to get a good idea. He then decides to completely rip off every little ornament of the planet, just leaving just a bracelet of silver chain. Which, Deku, he's just saying if, Nejire gives him some time, he can give her something nice. And, Nejire's kind of taken back. What do you mean? You don't have to do that, Izuku. And Deku's just like, no. I feel like I owe you since, it was thanks to your words I was able to get this far with my quirk. And, Nejire, she blushes as, she smiles at Deku, and Deku's just, like, nodding. This is when Uraraka, she's, like, getting up and, like, she's being stretchered out. She's groaning and she's, like, saying, Izuku, forgive me. Nejire, she gets kind of mad at this. So, she is, like, for the sake of the show, to show off to Uraraka, she just wraps her arms around Izuku. And, she's just like, Izuku, I'm so glad for the gift that you're getting me. Uraraka's just like, huh? Deku's just like, I feel something soft squishing behind my back. Oh, they feel so firm. Deku, he just, like, turns around, like, he's able to, like, spin his, like, turn it, like, get his bearings back. He then turns to face Nejire, blushing a little bit, because, sudden showing of affection. Deku's just like, you know what, I have a gift for you right now. Nejire's eyes are like, huh? Deku, in the heat of the moment, just like, you know what, fuck it. Go with it. Just go with it. And, he might have been misreading her signal, which, yes, he did, but she's not going to be too mad at him, but it is for the sake of hilarity. Deku pulls in Nejire and gives her a kiss. Nejire's eyes, like, they're widen. Her face turns red. She, like, calms down as she accepts Deku's kiss. And Deku, he himself was just like, this wasn't what I thought would, like, happen. But this is where something else happens. This is when one of the reporters, like, they're wanting to interview Deku after his first, fight and win and how he feels about going Todoroki. And, the camera turns in saying, here's the, like, anchor woman saying, and here we are about to approach, hopefully we're about to get word with Izuku, Midoriya, where he was supposed to be. It's live, so, they turn the corner, just in time to see Deku plant a kiss on Nejire. And, cameras everywhere. The whole stadium just, like, turns to see Deku kissing Nejire Hato. Like, the whole stadium, the whole world sees this. Ryu, she's just smiling. Aizawa's just like, damn, problem child. Just, damn, you work fast. All Might's just like, young Midoriya, I'm proud of you. Inko's just like, I like this one. Like, that was the nice one she met. Deku, he does pull in Nejire. Nejire does kind of pull in Deku. So the kiss does, like, deepen after, like, a slight pause after the two lips make contact. And, eventually it is broken up by, Todoroki just walking in and saying, Midoriya, I'm going to defeat you next round. And I'll do it without my fire side. This is enough for, like, Nejire and Izuku to break apart. And, the two are, like, collecting their recollections, like, wait, huh? There were people? Shit. Wait, when did people get here? They're both kind of confused. Oh, Travis, I love you too. Good girl. Anyway, Uraraka, she's just, like, carried away, hollowed out. Like, she's just like, this bitch. She's carried away. The camera then, like, turns to Todoroki, as, he's saying he's going to beat him without his father's power. No one's really noticed the camera. And, this is when, Nejire and Deku are still holding one another. When Deku's just saying, like, he's just bluntly about it, are you fucking stupid? Like, your quirk is called half and half. The combination of your father and your mother's, not their power in you, it's your power. Deku's saying is, unbeknownst to both of them, he kind of started to float. Nejire, she's fine because she's already floating. But, she realizes, Deku's actually floating head on head with her. The camera then turns to Izuku, which, they see Deku floating just like half a foot off the ground. Aizawa, All Might, everyone's just eyes are widened because they're like, wait, he can fly? Float? He's up in the... Like, what is this bullshit? We thought he could just punch things really hard and was really fast. They're kind of confused. And All Might, just like the second after his confusion fades, it occurs to him that quirk, that's Masters. Of course, there are two key people who see this. Gran Torino, who instantly recognizes that is not a Shimura's quirk. And then All for One, who's realizing that Izuku Midoriya not only is the successor of One for All, but he seems to have awakened the quirks, of Nana. And he's thinking, is this boy going to awaken other quirks of the users? All Might, he clenches his fist as, he tells Dr. Ujiko to proceed with their plans early. So, he tells Tomura that he's going in the pod, whether he likes it or not, because, they now know exactly who the One for All successor is. And if Tomura is to be the successor of All for One, then they can't waste any more time. And Tomura, get in the goddamn pod. You're going to be in there for quite a while. Now, keep in mind, this means he is not going through his quirk awakening. He's not going to be awake for the Metal Liberation arc. He's not going to be awake for the 8 Precincts one. In fact, Shigaraki's going to go to sleep for the next year and a half. Now, during this time, All for One states that the one who will be in charge is, Dabi. Dabi smiles and he agrees. And things that's the League of Villains for right now. And, Todoroki, not Todoroki, fuck. Endeavor is just, confused at what, Izuku said, and go how is it not my power? He has fire, I have fire. Since I have fire, his fire, my fire. It is fire. We have fire, it my fire too. Caveman speaky. Just for the sake of hilarity. And I think that's enough. So, yeah, hour and 5 seconds. No, hour 13 minutes. That's good enough time. This is a 2-parter. The other half I'll upload later today, just because I want to watch What If Deku Had a Black Panther Quirk by Shoto Aizawa. Now, I hope y'all have a good one. This is the Vibe Kage signing out, and I'm tired. Also, go to HukeDub to go see some new what ifs that I'll be posting solely on her channel. And if you're asking why, they're gonna pay me, and I'm not even monetized, my guy. I'm not doing this for the sake of money. She's just saying, hey, we'll pay you. I'm like, fuck it, why not? So, be on the lookout for some what ifs on her channel by me, featuring Le Vibe Kage. Deuces, my guys. Have a great one.